It's such a critical thing to gauge risks to rights holders early in fieldwork. So often, desk research will lead you to believe that one group is vulnerable when the on the ground reality proves that completely different. Outside of Nomagea work, I worked on a consulting project at an operation in North Africa several years back, and all the literature suggested that the vulnerable rights holders were nomadic communities whose herding patterns could be impacted. And we headed straight out to the communities on our first full day on site and did indeed learn new challenges that they faced. But the company had already started working to address community issues, they had good engagement. And meanwhile, another far less attended to population was the contractor workforce, which was being housed in a camp separate from direct employees. And that was the first we'd actually heard of this contractor camp, which immediately raised flags. The people that companies aren't talking to or about are often the most vulnerable. So we went to the contractor camp and found unclean drinking water, unprotected perimeters, labor practices that were, to euphemize, inconsistent with human rights. And there would have been plenty to discuss with the communities, but they were already so clearly on the company's radar and so capable of advocating for themselves that we needed to reallocate our time to a population that was far less visible. Methodologically, it's not a choice so much as an outcome. In the assessment process, we look very systematically at an array of topics that cover context and operation, company background with regard to environment, labor, socio-political conditions, security, corruption, health, civic space, and even project engineering. These topics are often technical in nature because it's important to differentiate the perceptions of rights holders, or for that matter, the company personnel, from the evidence that's available. And the reason it's so key to integrate the technical and perceptional in evaluating all these topics is that seeing where the two don't line up is critical for developing recommendations. I think one of the best examples I have of this is we worked for many years piloting a human rights impact assessment and monitoring tool at the hria uranium mine in Malawi, where this question of identifying the right was critical. Everyone on the ground and in the international media was certain that the problem was going to be radiation poisoning because it's a uranium mine. But it was actually so well engineered and managed that there were no radiation impacts at all. Indeed, the monitoring program they had in place was so comprehensive that the mine shut down some local drinking wells that predated mining and supplemented water resources from clean wells to protect people from baseline radiation. But they did a terrible job communicating this to people, so everyone lived in constant fear. The mine faced these endless allegations of environmental harm and radiation poisoning and ultimately shut down. And we were explicit in our recommendations that the impacted right wasn't the right to a clean environment, but rather the right to public participation and to access to information. And I think that by the time senior leadership had internalized this, the company was in crisis because uranium prices had tanked and they had no capacity to implement the recommendations. But you know, the company ultimately shut down that mine, and it was just rebought this year by a company that I hope opens the mine's doors with a schedule of how they'll publicly report environmental monitoring. The hazard with any mine that is working with a hazardous or radioactive ore is that people will always be scared for their health and people will always be worried about environmental impacts. And if you are managing those impacts, then there's still a critical role in managing the perceptions. Scoping the actual assessment gets to the core of so many issues for me. Companies have asked me to scope an assessment to the confines of their fences or to a single structure within a fence. One company operating in a conflict zone actually asked to have an assessment that scoped to exclude a critical rights holder group. And HRIAs need to be scoped with the input of the assessors themselves because human rights frameworks view people and conceptualize impacts differently than operators do. There's an assessment that I'm working on right now as a consultant where one well-intentioned company actually commissioned separate HRIAs for 3 discrete operations in the same region, because their corporate organizational structure viewed each operation as a distinct branch of the business. But this belied the interrelationships among them. The operations were also linked to a port, and the company had been the driving force for the workforce migration that had established an urban zone around the industrial site. But only one of those 3 operations managed community relations, which meant that communities impacted by the other 2 operations had no clear path for making complaints or engaging with the company to effect change. And I'm still working on the outcomes of this assessment, but one of the main findings is that the business organizational structure can't fully dictate the human rights interventions that a company plans, and that ongoing research should look at the interconnections among these operations.